The dust of the open range settled on everything, including the soul. For Amelia Barlow, a widow carving a life from the unforgiving soil, it was a constant reminder of her solitude. But when a shadow fell across her doorway, it wasn't the setting sun. It was a Lakota scout bleeding on the brink of death, a man her neighbors would sooner see dead. Her hands, calloused from work, hesitated for only a heartbeat. In that moment, she sealed her fate. Not knowing that an act of mercy would ignite a firestorm, and the man she saved would return with a force that could shatter her world. The Wyoming wind was a relentless thief. It stole the warmth from a man's bones and the hope from his heart, leaving behind a fine grit of dust that coated everything Amelia Barlow owned. It settled in the lines around her eyes, a constant, gritty reminder of the 5 years she'd spent trying to tame this unforgiving land since her husband, Thomas, had been laid to rest in its stubborn soil. The small cabin nestled in the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains felt more like a cage. Some days its rough-hewn logs, a testament to a shared dream that had died with him. Her days were a litany of chores, a rhythm of survival that left little room for thought, and even less for feeling. She mended fences, tended her small flock of sheep, and nurtured a vegetable garden that was in a constant battle with the arid climate. Her closest neighbors, the Hendersons, were a good mile down the creek, and their infrequent visits were a double-edged sword of welcome company and prying questions. Beatrice Henderson, a woman whose piety was as sharp as her nose, always seemed to be measuring Amelia's grief, judging her solitude. This particular afternoon, the sun beat down with a ferocity that bleached the sky to a pale, hazy blue. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and the low bleating of her sheep. Amelia was in the lean-to, sharpening the blade of a shovel, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone, a familiar comfort. It was then that she felt it. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a silence that fell over the land like a heavy blanket. The crickets ceased their chirping, the birds in the lone cottonwood tree fell quiet. A prickle of unease crawled up her spine. She wasn't a woman given to flights of fancy, but the frontier had taught her to trust her instincts. Her hand tightened on the handle of the shovel. Slowly she rose to her feet, her eyes scanning the vast, empty expanse that stretched out before her cabin. The shimmering heat haze distorted the horizon, making the distant buttes dance and sway. Then she saw it. A figure staggering, emerging from the heat waves like a phantom. It was a man, his form wavering, his gait unsteady. As he drew closer, the details sharpened into a terrifying reality. He was an Indian, a Lakota, by the look of his buckskin clothing and the single eagle feather tied in his long, dark hair. But it was the crimson stain that blossomed across his chest and down his side that made her breath catch in her throat. He was hurt badly. He stumbled, catching himself on the corner of her rail fence, his body slumping against the rough wood. His head was bowed, his face obscured by a curtain of sweat-soaked hair. For a long moment, Amelia remained frozen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every cautionary tale, every whispered horror story she had ever heard about the savages flooded her mind. The recent tensions, the skirmishes between the settlers and the Lakota over the ever-shrinking buffalo herds, were a constant source of fear in the small community of Redemption Creek. To harbor a Lakota, a wounded warrior no less, was not just foolish, it was suicidal. Her first instinct was to run, to bolt the door, and pray he would simply bleed out and die, becoming another forgotten casualty of this brutal land. She could pretend she had never seen him. But then the man's head lifted, and his eyes met hers. They were dark, fathomless pools of pain, but in their depths she saw not the savagery she had been taught to expect, but a raw, desperate plea for life. In that instant, he wasn't a faceless enemy. He was a man bleeding and alone just as she was, in her own way. The memory of Thomas, his face pale and clammy as the fever stole the life from him, flashed in her mind. She had been helpless then, her knowledge of healing limited to the simple folk remedies her mother had taught her. She had watched him slip away, her heart breaking with each shallow breath. She couldn't watch another man die. Not like this. With a resolve that surprised even herself, Amelia dropped the shovel and walked towards the fence. The Lakota warrior watched her approach, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the knife tucked into his waistband. His body was tense, coiled like a snake, ready to strike despite his obvious weakness. I mean you no harm, she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. She raised her hands, palms open, a universal gesture of peace she hoped he would understand. You're hurt. He said nothing, his dark eyes never leaving hers, searching, questioning. She could see the deep gash in his side now, a ragged tear in his flesh that was oozing blood. He was losing too much too fast. He wouldn't last much longer in the unforgiving sun. Let me help you, she said, her voice a little stronger this time. Please. She took another tentative step, and then another, until she was standing just a few feet from him. The smell of sweat blood and the wildness of the prairie clung to him. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps no older than 25, his face etched with lines of pain, but also a fierce, untamed pride. He swayed on his feet, his grip on the fence the only thing keeping him upright. His eyes flickered, the light in them dimming. He was on the verge of collapse. Amelia knew she had only seconds to decide. To help him was to invite the wrath of her neighbors, to risk being branded a traitor, an Indian lover. To turn him away was to condemn him to death. She looked into his eyes one last time, and in their shared humanity, their shared struggle for survival in this vast, indifferent land, she made her choice. She reached out her hand, steady, and gestured towards the open door of her cabin. Come, she said, her voice soft but firm. Let me help you. The Lakota warrior held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, a silent, intense communication passing between them. Then, with a shuddering sigh, he relinquished his grip on the fence and took a stumbling step towards her. His life, for now, in the hands of a stranger. The shadow had passed through her door, and Amelia Barlow's solitary life was about to be irrevocably changed. The scent of blood, coppery and sharp, filled the small cabin, overpowering the familiar aroma of wood smoke and dried herbs. Getting the wounded Lakota inside had been an ordeal. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone that taxed Amelia's strength to its limits. He had collapsed onto the packed earth floor just inside the doorway, leaving a grim trail of crimson in his wake. For a moment, Amelia stood over him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, a wave of panic washing over her. What had she done? The reality of her decision settled upon her with a crushing weight. He was a Lakota, a people her community considered their mortal enemies. If anyone were to find him here... She pushed the thought aside. There was no turning back now. First, she had to stop the bleeding. She hurried to the small chest where she kept her meager medical supplies. Clean rags, a bottle of carbolic acid she used for cleaning, and a needle and thread for stitching. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Kneeling beside him, she gently began to cut away the blood-soaked buckskin of his shirt. His skin was hot to the touch, a sign that fever was already setting in. As she exposed the wound, a gasp escaped her lips. It was worse than she had imagined. A deep, jagged gash ran from his lower ribs down his side, the flesh torn and angry. It was a bullet wound by the look of it. He'd been shot, and recently. The Lakota warrior was conscious, his eyes following her every move, his jaw clenched against the pain. He didn't speak, but his silence was a heavy, watchful presence in the room. Amelia worked with a focused intensity, her hands surprisingly steady. She cleaned the wound as best she could with a cloth soaked in carbolic acid, earning a sharp hiss of pain from the man. "I know it hurts," she said, her voice gentle. "But I have to clean it, or the poison will set in." He grunted in response, a sound that could have been acknowledgement or just a reaction to the searing pain. His eyes, dark and intelligent, never left her face. She felt as though he were reading her, peeling back the layers of her quiet, lonely existence to see the woman beneath. As she worked, her mind drifted back to Thomas. He had been a kind man, a dreamer with calloused hands and a heart full of hope for their future in this new land. He had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, his laughter echoing in the small space as he worked. They had shared so many dreams, so many plans. A family, a prosperous ranch, a life filled with love and laughter. But the frontier had a cruel way of shattering dreams. The fever had come on suddenly, and within a week he was gone, leaving Amelia with nothing but the ghost of a life that might have been. Now here she was, tending to another man on the brink of death, a man who was supposed to be her enemy. The irony was not lost on her. Perhaps this was her penance, her chance to succeed where she had failed with Thomas. Or perhaps it was simply a fool's errand, an act of reckless compassion that would be her undoing. The wound was too deep to be left open. It needed to be stitched. Amelia threaded the needle, her fingers fumbling slightly. She had stitched torn clothing and even a gash on one of her sheep, but never human flesh. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, her voice barely a whisper. "I have nothing for the pain." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes closing for a moment as he braced himself. She took a deep breath and made the first stitch. The man's body jerked, and a low groan escaped his lips, but he did not cry out. With each stitch, a silent, grim understanding passed between them. He was a warrior accustomed to pain, and she was a woman of the frontier, no stranger to hardship. She worked in a trance-like state, her world shrinking to the needle, the thread and the torn flesh beneath her fingers. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the man's ragged breathing and the soft whisper of the thread as it pulled through his skin. As she tied off the last stitch, her hands were trembling, her brow slick with sweat. She gently covered the wound with a clean cloth, her touch lingering for a moment on his feverish skin. He had survived the worst of it for now. But the danger was far from over. The fever was a relentless enemy, and she knew the next few days would be critical. She managed to get him to drink some water. His lips cracked and dry. He was weak, his body racked with shivers, but he was alive. She dragged a pallet of blankets near the hearth, and with a strength she didn't know she possessed, managed to move him onto it. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across the cabin, Amelia sat in a chair by the fire, watching him sleep. In the flickering firelight, his features softened. The harsh lines of pain eased, and he looked younger or vulnerable. His name, she realized, was a mystery to her. She knew nothing of him, his family, his life. He was simply a man she had chosen to save. A sudden noise outside made her jump. the sound of horses' hooves coming fast. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had someone seen him? Was it the Hendersons, or worse, the town marshal, a hard man named Jebediah Stone, with a well-known hatred for the Lakota? She rushed to the window, her hands trembling as she peered through a crack in the curtains. A lone rider was approaching his form, silhouetted against the dying light. As he drew closer, she recognized him. It was Mr. Henderson. Her mind raced. What should she do? She couldn't let him in. He would see the Lakota, and then everything would be lost. She had to get rid of him quickly. She unbolted the door and stepped outside, forcing a smile onto her face. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice a little too bright. What a surprise. He tipped his hat, his face etched with concern. "Amelia, I was just checking on you. Saw your light on. Everything all right?" "Fine, just fine," she said, trying to keep her tone casual. "Just a long day." His eyes narrowed, and he glanced past her at the closed cabin door. "You sure? You look a bit flustered." "Just tired," she insisted, her heart pounding. The sheep were a handful today. He seemed to accept her explanation, but his gaze lingered on the cabin for a moment too long. "Well, you take care of yourself, Amelia. These are dangerous times. There's been talk of Lakota war parties in the area." "I'll be careful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, then turned his horse and rode off into the growing darkness. Amelia watched him go, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and dread. She had averted disaster for now, but Henderson's visit was a stark reminder of the precariousness of her situation. She was living on borrowed time. She returned to the cabin and bolted the door, her sense of isolation more profound than ever. She was alone with a wounded enemy in her care and a community that would not hesitate to condemn her. She looked at the sleeping Lakota, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. His life was in her hands. But she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was now in his as well. The act of mercy had bound them together, for better or for worse. And in the vast, silent wilderness of Wyoming, Amelia Barlow could only pray that she had not made a fatal mistake. The next few days passed in a blur of feverish anxiety and hushed care. The Lakota, whose name she still did not know, drifted in and out of consciousness, his body a battlefield where life and death waged a silent war. Amelia was his sole ally, a constant presence by his side, bathing his fevered brow with cool water and forcing spoonfuls of thin broth between his cracked lips. She rarely slept her nights, spent in a rocking chair by the hearth, her ears attuned to every sound from outside, every pained murmur from the man on the pallet. The cabin became her world, a sanctuary and a prison. The silence was a living thing, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the man's labored breathing. During his lucid moments, he would watch her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of pain, gratitude, and an unnerving intensity. They still did not speak, their communication a silent language of gestures and shared glances. She would point to the water bucket, and he would nod. He would touch the bandage on his side, his brow furrowed in a silent question, and she would gently press him back down, her touch conveying a reassurance she did not feel. One afternoon, as she was changing his dressing, he spoke for the first time. His voice was raspy, weak from disuse. "Wichapi," he said, his gaze fixed on her face. Amelia looked at him confused. I don't understand." He pointed a finger towards the small, grimy window, where the first star of the evening was just beginning to appear in the twilight sky. "Wichapi," he repeated. "Star." Then he pointed to himself. "One plea," he said, his voice a little stronger. "Eagle." He then pointed at her. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. He was telling her his name. One plea. Eagle. And he had given her a name. Wichapi. Star. A small tentative smile touched her lips. "Amelia," she said, pointing to herself. He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Amelia." He repeated the syllables, strange and foreign on his tongue. It was a breakthrough, a fragile bridge built between two disparate worlds. In the days that followed, he began to speak more, teaching her simple Lakota words for the things around them. Sun, moon, fire, water. In return, she taught him their English counterparts. They were a strange pair, a lonely widow and a wounded warrior, finding a sliver of common ground in the shared language of survival. But outside the four walls of the cabin, the world was growing more hostile. Beatrice Henderson paid a visit, her eyes sharp and suspicious. She noted the extra pallet by the fire, the way Amelia seemed tired and on edge. "You're looking peaked, Amelia," she said, her voice laced with a cloying concern that set Amelia's teeth on edge. "It's not good for a woman to be alone so much. You should come to the prayer meeting on Sunday." Amelia politely declined making an excuse about the sheep, but she could feel Beatrice's suspicious gaze on her back as she left. The encounter left her rattled. The secret she was keeping felt like a physical weight pressing down on her, suffocating her. One plea was growing stronger. The fever had broken, and the color was returning to his face. He was able to sit up, and then to stand, leaning on a makeshift crutch Amelia had fashioned for him. He would watch her as she went about her chores, a silent, thoughtful expression on his face. One evening, as she was mending a tear in his buckskin shirt, he spoke, his English still halting but clear. "Why?" he asked, his dark eyes searching hers. "Why you help me?" Amelia paused, the needle still in her hand. She looked at him, at his proud warrior's face, and for the first time she answered with the unvarnished truth. "My husband. He died. I couldn't save him. I couldn't watch another man die, even if he was." She trailed off, not wanting to say the word enemy. Wanbley nodded, a deep sadness in his eyes. "I understand loss," he said softly. "My people. We lose much. Our land's the buffalo. Soon there will be nothing left." In that moment, the chasm between their worlds seemed to shrink. They were not just a white woman and a Lakota man. They were two people who had known grief. Two people who were struggling to survive in a world that was rapidly changing, a world that seemed to have no place for them. A few days later, Wan Bli announced that he was ready to leave. He was still weak, but the fire had returned to his eyes. He was a man of the wilderness, and the confinement of the cabin was chafing at his spirit. Amelia's heart sank. She had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, to their strange shared solitude. The thought of being alone again, truly alone, was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But she knew she couldn't keep him here. It was too dangerous for both of them. She packed him a small bundle of food, dried meat, a loaf of bread, and a canteen of water. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. He stood at the door, tall and proud, the morning sun casting a long shadow behind him. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You saved my life, Wichapi," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "I will not forget." He reached out, and with a startling gentleness, touched her cheek. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was as soft as a feather. "Be safe," he whispered. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the vast, empty landscape as silently as he had appeared. Amelia watched him go, a profound sense of loss washing over her. She was alone again, but her solitude was short-lived. The next morning, as she was milking her goat, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Not one rider this time, but several. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked up to see a group of men riding towards her cabin, their faces grim and determined. At their head was Marshal Stone, his silver star glinting in the morning sun. And riding beside him, a triumphant, self-righteous expression on her face, was Beatrice Henderson. Amelia knew with a sickening certainty that her secret was out. Beatrice must have seen Juan Blee leaving, or perhaps she had simply put the pieces together. It didn't matter. The reckoning had come. Marshal Stone dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Amelia Barlow," he said, his voice cold and hard as steel. "We have reason to believe you've been harboring a Lakota fugitive." Amelia's blood ran cold. She looked at the faces of the men behind him, her neighbors' men she had known for years. They looked at her with a mixture of anger, fear, and betrayal. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice weak. "Don't lie to us!" Amelia Beatrice Henderson spat, her voice dripping with venom. "I saw him leave here myself with my own 2 eyes. An Indian, bold as brass, walking away from your cabin." The men muttered amongst themselves, their anger growing. "An Indian lover," one of them snarled. "You put us all in danger," Amelia Marshal Stone said, his voice low and menacing. "That Lakota could be a scout for a war party. He could be leading them back here right now to murder us all in our beds." The fear in the men's eyes was palpable, fanned into a raging inferno by Stone's words. Amelia opened her mouth to protest, to try and explain. But she knew it was useless. They wouldn't listen. They didn't want to understand. They wanted a scapegoat, someone to blame for their own fear and hatred. "You're coming with us," Stone said, pulling a pair of iron shackles from his belt. "You'll stand trial for treason." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as the cold metal closed around her wrists. She was one of them, yet they treated her like an enemy. She had shown mercy, and for that she was being condemned. As they led her away from her home, her life, a flicker of movement on the distant horizon, caught her eye. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, a mirage in the shimmering heat. But then the shape became clearer. It was a rider, sitting atop a pinto pony, watching them from a high ridge. It was Juan Blee. He was too far away for her to see his expression, but she knew he was watching. He had seen what was happening. Her heart sank. She had saved his life, and now, because of him, she was losing her own. As she was forced onto the back of a horse, her hands bound before her, a new terrifying thought entered her mind. Marshal Stone had spoken of war parties of the Lakota returning to murder them all. Juan Blee was a warrior. He had told her he would not forget her act of kindness. But what did that mean? Would he return to save her? Or would he return with his tribe not to rescue her, but to exact a terrible revenge on the people who had taken her captive? The dust kicked up by the horse's hooves stung her eyes, but she couldn't look away from the lone figure on the ridge. He remained there, a silent, motionless sentinel, until the rolling hills swallowed him from view. And in the desolate silence of her heart, Amelia Barlow was consumed by a new and terrible fear. She had treated a shot Lakota scout, not knowing that he would come back. and now she could only pray that his return would not be her final damnation. The journey to Redemption Creek was a nightmare of dust humiliation and fear. Amelia, her hands bound so tightly the rope cut into her wrists, was paraded through the center of the small, dusty town like a captured animal. Faces peered from behind curtains, and whispers followed her like a swarm of angry bees. The people she had once called her neighbors now looked at her with a chilling mixture of fear and contempt. They saw her not as Amelia Barlow, the grieving widow, but as a traitor, a woman who had sided with the enemy. She was thrown into the town's only jail cell, a cramped, filthy space that smelled of stale sweat and despair. The single-barred window looked out onto the main street, a constant reminder of the world she had lost. Marshal Stone, his face a mask of cold authority, informed her that the circuit judge would be arriving in a week and that she would be tried for treason against the United States government. The charge was absurd, but in the fevered atmosphere of fear and paranoia that gripped the frontier, she knew it was a death sentence. Days bled into one another in a monotonous cycle of fear and hopelessness. Her only human contact was with the deputy, a young, nervous boy named Billy, who would shove a plate of stale bread and a tin cup of water through the bars of her cell. He wouldn't meet her eyes, his shame and fear a palpable presence in the small room. Amelia's thoughts were consumed by Wanbley. Had he simply abandoned her to her fate, or was he planning something? The ambiguity was a form of torture. She replayed their last conversation in her mind, his promise that he would not forget. But what did that promise mean? Was it a vow of gratitude or a threat of retribution? One afternoon, as she was staring listlessly out the window, she saw him. He was standing at the edge of town near the blacksmith's forge, partially hidden in the shadows. Her heart leaped into her throat. He was here. He hadn't abandoned her. But what was he doing? He was alone, and the town was on high alert. He couldn't possibly hope to rescue her by himself. He met her gaze from across the dusty street, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. The distance between them a vast, unbridgeable chasm. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and melted back into the shadows. The next morning, the town awoke to a terrifying sight. On the ridge overlooking Redemption Creek, where Wanbley had watched her being taken away, a line of Lakota warriors sat on horseback, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. They were motionless, silent, 100 or more, their presence a silent, ominous threat. Panic erupted in the town. Men grabbed their rifles, their faces pale with fear. Women herded their children indoors, their voices shrill with terror. The nightmare that Marshal Stone had invoked had come to pass. The Lakota had come. From her cell, Amelia could hear the shouts and the rising tide of fear. She pressed her face against the bars, her heart pounding. This was her fault. She had brought this upon them. Marshal Stone, his face grim, organized a makeshift militia, a motley crew of farmers and shopkeepers who were more accustomed to handling plows than rifles. They took up positions behind barrels and in doorways, their fear a tangible thing in the hot, still air. Then a lone rider detached himself from the line of warriors on the ridge and began to make his way slowly down towards the town. He carried no weapon, his hands held open at his sides. It was Wanbley. He stopped his horse in the middle of the main street, a lone figure of calm in a sea of rising panic. His gaze swept over the armed men, the boarded-up windows, and finally came to rest on the jailhouse. Marshal Stone, flanked by 2 of his men, stepped out to meet him. his shotgun held at the ready. "What do you want, savage?" he shouted, his voice tight with tension. One Blee's voice when he spoke was calm and clear, carrying easily in the silent, watchful air. "I have come for Wichapi," he said, using the name he had given Amelia. "I have come for the woman you hold captive." "She's a traitor," Stone snarled. "She'll be tried and hanged for her crimes." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the armed settlers. One Blee's expression did not change. "She committed no crime," he said, his voice even. "She showed mercy to a dying man, a compassion you do not seem to understand." He then turned his gaze to the crowd of armed men, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. "My father is the chief of this tribe, a great warrior named Matokanunpa, an old wise man. He has come today for his son, whom the woman in your jail saved from death's door. He has not come here seeking war with your people. He has come for the woman who saved the life of his own son. He has come to offer you a trade." Stone laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "A trade? What could you possibly have to offer us?" One Blee gestured to the warriors on the ridge. "My father has brought with him a great many horses, a wealth of furs and other goods that would be of great value to your community. He is prepared to offer you all of this, a bride price, if you will, in exchange for the safe return of the woman and a pact of peace between our peoples." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If you refuse," he continued, his voice hardening, "he will take her, and there will be much bloodshed. He has no wish for this. He wishes only for the safe return of his son's savior. Make no mistake, Marshal. We are many. You are few. You cannot win a fight against us." Stone's face was a thundercloud of conflicting emotions. Greed warred with pride, fear with hatred. The offer of wealth was tempting a prize that could enrich the entire community. But to bow to the demands of a Lakota chief, it was a bitter pill to swallow. The townsfolk muttered amongst themselves, their fear now mixed with a greedy avarice. Horses and furs. It was a fortune. Was the life of one traitorous woman worth turning down such a prize? From her cell, Amelia listened with a growing sense of disbelief. One Blee had not come for revenge. He had come to bargain for her life. He had brought his entire tribe not to destroy the town, but to save her. She watched as a rider, an older man with a weathered face and an air of quiet authority, made his way down from the ridge to join One Blee. It was his father, the chief. He dismounted and stood beside his son, his gaze sweeping over the town with an ancient, unyielding pride. He spoke in Lakota, his voice a low, guttural rumble, and One Blee translated. "My father says you have 1 hour to decide," One Blee announced. "Release the woman and accept our offer of peace and prosperity, or face the consequences." The 2 Lakota then turned their horses and rode back towards the ridge, leaving the town to its momentous decision. The silence they left behind was heavier, more pregnant with meaning than any sound. Amelia leaned her head against the cold iron bars of her cell, her heart a whirlwind of emotions. She had treated a shot Lakota scout, a single act of mercy, in a world defined by hatred and violence. And now that act had brought 2 peoples to the brink of a war, with her own life hanging in the balance. The fate of Redemption Creek and her own now rested on a choice between greed and pride, between peace and bloodshed. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the hour began to tick away. The hour that followed was the longest of Amelia's life. The town of Redemption Creek became a pressure cooker of fear, greed, and frantic debate. From her cell, Amelia could hear the raised voices, the angry arguments, the desperate pleas. The townsfolk were divided. On one side were men like Marshal Stone and Beatrice Henderson's husband, fueled by a deep-seated hatred and a stubborn pride. "We don't negotiate with savages," Stone bellowed, his voice echoing down the dusty street. "We show them we are not afraid. We fight." On the other side were the more pragmatic members of the community. Men like the shopkeeper, Mr. Abernathy, and some of the poorer farmers, for whom the promise of the Lakota's wealth was a siren song. Fight with what Marshal Abernathy's reedy voice countered. "They outnumber us 10 to 1. They'll slaughter us all. Think of the women and children." The debate raged, a microcosm of the larger conflict that defined the West. The clash between fear and reason, between ingrained prejudice and the cold, hard reality of survival. Amelia listened, her heart aching. These were her people, yet they spoke of her life as a commodity, a bargaining chip. She was the cause of this crisis, and yet she was utterly powerless to influence its outcome. As the deadline approached, the tension in the town became unbearable. The makeshift militia grew more and more nervous, their eyes constantly darting towards the silent, watchful line of warriors on the ridge. The Lakota had not moved their patience, a terrifying display of disciplined power. Finally, with only minutes to spare, a decision was reached. It was Mr. Abernathy who came to her cell, his face pale and sweating. He fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling. "They've agreed," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They're going to let you go." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over Amelia. She was going to live. But Abernathy's next words sent a chill down her spine. "But you can't stay here, Amelia," he said. His eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "Part of the deal is that you have to leave. The Hendersons and some of the others, they won't have you here. They say you've brought a curse upon the town." Amelia nodded, a bitter taste in her mouth. She had expected as much. She had become a pariah, a woman caught between two worlds belonging to neither. Marshal Stone, his face a mask of sullen anger, escorted her out of the jailhouse. The entire town seemed to be gathered in the main street, their faces a mixture of relief, resentment, and shame. No one would meet her eyes. One plea and his father were waiting for her in the middle of the street, a spare horse, a beautiful pinto mare, held in readiness. As she approached, Wanbley dismounted and walked towards her. He stopped in front of her, his dark eyes searching her face. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice soft. She shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He reached out and gently touched the raw red marks on her wrists where the ropes had been. A flicker of anger crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a look of profound sadness. "They do not understand," he said, his voice low. "They are ruled by fear." He helped her onto the pinto mare, his touch sending a familiar jolt of warmth through her. She looked at him, at this man, who had repaid her act of kindness with a gesture of such immense power and grace. He had not only saved her life, he had shown her a world beyond the narrow confines of her own existence. The exchange was made. The Lakota brought forth a herd of fine horses, their coats gleaming in the sun, and bundles of rich beaver and fox pelts. The townsfolk, their greed overcoming their pride, eagerly accepted the offering. It was a strange, silent transaction, a peace bought with wealth, a life bartered for goods. As Amelia and the Lakota prepared to leave, Beatrice Henderson, her face contorted with a righteous fury, stepped forward. "Don't you ever come back here, you traitorous witch!" she shrieked, her voice filled with venom. "You've brought the devil to our doorstep." Amelia looked at the woman, at her face twisted with hate and fear, and she felt not anger, but a profound pity. Beatrice, like so many others, was trapped in a prison of her own making, a prison of prejudice and ignorance. One plea placed a calming hand on Amelia's arm. "Do not listen to her," he said. "Her heart is small." He then turned to Marshal Stone, his voice ringing with a cold authority. "The peace we have made today is a fragile thing," he said. "If any harm comes to this woman, if you or your people ever threaten her again, the consequences will be far greater than a loss of wealth." With that, he mounted his horse, and the Lakota tribe, with Amelia in their midst, turned and rode away from Redemption Creek, leaving the town to its newfound riches and its uneasy peace. Amelia did not look back. She rode with her head held high, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of the prairie that stretched out before her. She was leaving behind a life of lonely survival, a life defined by loss and hardship. She did not know what the future held where she was going, or what her life among the Lakota would be like. But as she rode beside Wanbli, the wind in her hair and the sun on her face, she felt a sense of freedom she had not known since Thomas had died. She was no longer just Amelia Barlow, the grieving widow. She was Wichapi, the woman who had been named for a star, the woman who had dared to show mercy in a merciless land. Her act of compassion had cost her everything she had known, but it had also given her a new beginning. She had treated a shot Lakota scout a single impulsive act that had ignited a firestorm of drama and fear. But from the ashes of that fire, a new life, a new hope was beginning to emerge. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Amelia Barlow was not afraid. She was riding towards a new dawn, under the watchful gaze of the eagle and the endless starlit sky of the American West. The world flattened and expanded. Riding away from the cramped, judgmental confines of Redemption Creek was like taking a first breath after nearly drowning. The Lakota tribe moved not as a frantic posse, but as a living river flowing across the plains. The procession was a symphony of sounds Amelia had only ever associated with fear, the thud of hundreds of hooves on the dry earth, the jingle of harnesses, the creak of travois poles dragging behind the horses, carrying the tribe's belongings. But here within the river, the sounds were not threatening. They were the rhythm of life, a steady, powerful pulse that spoke of community and purpose. Amelia rode the pinto mare beside Wanbli, feeling small and utterly conspicuous. Her calico dress and worn leather boots were a stark contrast to the buckskin and beadwork of the people around her. Women with intricate braids and watchful eyes glanced at her, their expressions ranging from open curiosity to a cool, veiled suspicion. Children, bold and unafraid, would sometimes ride their ponies close, staring at her fair hair and pale skin, before giggling and darting away. She was an anomaly, a ghost from another world set down in their midst. The weight of their scrutiny was heavy, and a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She had traded one form of judgment for another. These were Wanbli's people, but they were not her people. She was the outsider, the reason their chief had been forced to bargain and trade to humble himself before the very men who were stealing their land. Did they resent her for it? As if sensing her unease, Wanbli leaned closer, his voice a low reassurance against the vastness of the prairie. "They are not judging you as the white man." He set his eyes on the horizon. "They are learning you." They see the woman my father Matokanumpa called Woman Who Saves. They see the woman I called Wichapi. They must decide for themselves if those names are true. That evening they made camp in a wide, grassy basin, sheltered by a crescent of low hills. The efficiency of the tribe was a marvel to Amelia. Within an hour, typists began to rise against the bruised twilight sky. Fires were kindled, and the air filled with the smells of roasting meat and the murmur of the Lakota language. It was a language that flowed like water, musical and complex, and it surrounded her, making her feel more alone than ever. She sat awkwardly by a fire Wanbli had built for them, unsure of her place of the proper etiquette. A young woman with a kind face and eyes the color of warm honey approached her, offering a wooden bowl of steaming bison stew. She introduced herself as Tasina Wanbli's cousin. "You must eat," Tasina said, in slow, careful English. "You are on a long journey now." Her smile was genuine, a small beacon of warmth in a sea of uncertainty. Amelia accepted the bowl, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered the simple words, feeling inadequate. The stew was rich and hearty, unlike anything she had ever tasted, and as she ate, she watched the life of the camp unfold around her. She saw families gathering elders, telling stories to wide-eyed children, warriors tending to their horses. There was a closeness here, an intricate web of connection that she had never witnessed in the isolated, fiercely individualistic world of the settlers. Later, as the first true stars began to prick the velvet darkness of the sky, Wanbli sat down beside her. For a long while, they were silent, watching the embers of their fire glow and fade. "Do you regret it?" he finally asked, his voice soft. "Leaving your home, your world." Amelia thought of her small, lonely cabin, the constant back-breaking work, the ghost of a life she had been clinging to. She thought of Beatrice Henderson's face twisted in hate, and Marshall Stone's cold, unforgiving eyes. My world had shrunk to 4 walls and a grave. She answered, her voice steady. There was nothing left for me there but bitterness and sorrow. I don't know if I will ever belong here, but I was already gone from there. He nodded, understanding passing between them without the need for further words. He pointed up at the sprawling canopy of light above them. The sky was immense, unobscured by hills or trees, a black ocean glittering with countless diamonds. "Wichapi," he said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "My mother told me that when we are born, a star is chosen for us, and when we die, we return to it to watch over the people. When I was near death in your cabin, and you lit a lamp, it was like a sa. In the darkness, you guided me back." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, blurring the brilliant constellations. He hadn't just given her a name. He had given her a place in his cosmology, a story. He had woven her into the fabric of his world. She looked away from the heavens and at the man beside her. In the flickering firelight, she saw not just a warrior, but a man of deep feeling and profound grace. The bond between them, forged in blood and desperation, was deepening into something else, something quieter and more powerful. It was a thread of trust, of mutual respect, of a shared understanding that transcended the color of their skin or the languages they spoke. She was still an outsider, a stranger on a long journey. The road ahead was unwritten, but for the first time, looking at the endless stars, hearing the quiet pulse of the camp around her, and feeling the steady presence of the man who had named her, for the light, Amelia felt a flicker of something she had long thought buried with Thomas. A fragile, tentative, but undeniable sense of hope. She was Wichapi, and she was home. The dust has settled on Redemption Creek, but the echoes of that fateful encounter remain. Amelia Barlow's choice, a single act of courage and compassion, forever altered the lives of two peoples. Her story is a stark reminder that in the heart of the unforgiving West, the deepest canyons weren't carved by rivers, but by the choices of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. What would you have done if this story of bravery, betrayal, and the complex tapestry of the frontier resonated with you? Please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves a powerful historical drama, and subscribe for more tales from the untamed heart of America. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive.